If you start strategically hiring in a global fashion, you get to access talent that you would never access if you're only hiring in a 30-kilometer radius. You simply get to work with people that probably have skills and competencies that you can't even imagine.
Nadia, the Welcome to the Future of Work podcast. Geez, all the way from South Africa, I should say.
Hey, Frank, so good to be here. Yeah, the only background noise you might hear is the hardy dust, right? We have these gigantic birds. So
Uh-huh.
maybe the sound will pick up a hardy dot today and we'll give your listeners something fun to think about and our giant birds in Joburg.
That sure works. The only background noise you'll hear is possibly my dog, that sort of thing. Nadia, you've been involved with remote work in the extreme, recruiting for companies, the building and involved with companies that have gone remote only, and big companies. We're not talking about 10 people, we're talking about thousands of people in single models. How do you develop a strategy? If you and I are going to build a company tomorrow, and let's assume it's a little uh, keep it technology. Let's assume it's a technology company or a internet enabled company at least, maybe an internet enabled company that distributes a product. How do we strategically make the decision to say, "Oh, I think I'll hire somebody in South Africa, Kenya, India, and the Philippines"? How do we strategically make that decision right from the beginning, which is when it's critical, I think, that we're going remote first?
Yeah, I think the cost element many people would raise, right? So there's this huge opportunity to hire in very cost efficient locations. But to me, that's not the most important thing. If you start strategically hiring in a global fashion, you get to access talent that you would never access if you're only hiring in a 30-kilometer radius. You simply get to work with people that probably have skills and competencies that you can't even imagine, right? So that privilege to work at companies like this benefits the person, but the company is getting skills and talent globally in locations that they simply would never have. I think the strategic part later comes in when you have a localization plan for languages or when you have a go to market plan, right? So imagine you had a go to market plan in the Philippines or in Germany. Hiring remotely from the beginning means that that footprint has already grown in those locations, right? And so as the company evolves and grows, it just becomes so much easier to start thinking about, right, do I need to sell into the German market? Do I have people there already that can help me, localize that, translate that, grow that? So I think it's, yeah.
Is it necessary to have a global marketing plan in order for a global remote first plan? Or can you have a remote first very regionally also? You talk about a 30-kilometer radius. That's pretty reasonable.
Yeah.
Commutes, things of that nature. What about a 300-kilometer radius where the commute is out of the question, obviously, and working on a regional or a local basis with a remote first plan also, which is probably what more companies think of, especially when they start. I can see
Yeah.
evolving to a global plan. All companies are international today.
Yeah.
We all have an
Yeah.
offshore, an international customer and an international team member
Yeah.
of some sort. So all companies are international, but we usually have a core focus. What's your thought process on that?
Yeah, as someone out here in South Africa, I would always highlight the fact that if you have teams outside of that 300-kilometer radius, that you have time zone coverage in places that you can't even think about,
You
right? So
can, right?
you have people following the sun without a single person having to follow the sun. Everyone gets to sleep, eat, have a life outside of work, right? Without having to work long hours because they're simply working in their time zone. And at companies like GitLab, I think that was a huge differentiator to scale a DevOps tool. Now I think they're a DevOps orchestrator,
Right.
right? But it put them in a position where all of a sudden their support engineering team was in, I don't know, 18 different time zones when they scaled. And in the beginning, maybe they were in 5 different time zones if they had 5 people. And so I think the benefit is all of a sudden, while you're sleeping, in your 30-kilometer radius, there are people that are working autonomously to get things done. And by your morning, you could literally carry on. And so I think it just is such a pace change. It's an opportunity to serve customers in global locations before you even have those customers.
Well, we are talking about the benefits of remote first. But what
Yeah,
about the strategic decision of how to go about that in order to achieve those benefits? Again, starting regionally, growing, well, in the United States nationally, because we have 6 time zones here, if you
yeah,
count all of them. Uh, and how are you thinking through that strategic positioning? Because we all start companies. We're
yeah,
all, serial entrepreneurs or obsessive entrepreneurs. We all start companies, and the strategy for the product, the strategy for the marketplace, et cetera, is always well thought through. But I don't think the hiring plans are thought through of where you're going to bring employees in. And I agree that you get a bigger talent pool, um, globally than you do regionally or locally or nationally. Um,
yeah,
But how do you reach that talent pool, or how do you set that? Again, I'll go back to the strategy that you lay. Says, "I'm gonna build a company, and it's gonna be global, and I'm gonna start hiring." Would you hire your first group regionally or locally and then expand from there? Or do you hire your maybe let's say you're starting a company and you say, "Well, I need a CEO or I need a CFO." I'm the CEO, you're the CEO. I need a CFO. How am I going to establish a CFO, all the controls, all the necessary things to do with the legal and the banking and everything. Start and build a finance department remote
yeah.
strategically.
Strategically, I have the unpopular opinion that you could still hire someone anywhere in the world, even for your CFO function. And I have experienced this firsthand at companies like remote.com, who's now more than 2,000 people in nearly 100 countries, right? And places like GitLab, which didn't ever select the location in the beginning. So when they started out, it was like, this position is remote first. We don't care where you're based. And I think that is a strategic decision. I think that comes down to, if you're competing against the local market, you can pay very competitively, right? Even in all these other locations without having to pay someone potentially a San Francisco, California, New York, or even London based salary, right?
Right.
And so it does give you that strategic opportunity to think about long term as you scale the company. What is your average cost per employee going to be? And if you start hiring everyone in one location, that's going to be your benchmark, right? That's gonna be your strategic cost that you will struggle to change, if you only hire in one location.
No, I agree with that,
Yeah.
strongly. We are a remote first company,
Yes.
and we have people scattered from Eastern Africa, through Europe and back through Central and Latin America, and um, in the all variety of the United States, the UK, et cetera.
Yeah.
We're not global, but we're half global. And our motivation, and I'll use our chief marketing officer as an example. When we started the company, the CFO and I were close physically. We had our offices in Las Vegas and Newport Beach, and it's a few hours back and forth, but we all knew each other really well, and so that all worked. And our corporate office, officially, all finance has always been in Las Vegas. Um, but our chief marketing officer lived in Kentucky, the fellow we wanted to hire, and he actually had a small farm that he lived on with his wife and kids and everything.
Nice.
And telling him, "Hey, I got this great job opportunity for you, and you're the best person for the job, and we want to pay you a fair, equitable salary, but you have to move to Las Vegas." Think in your brain, farm, Kentucky. neon lights, Las Vegas. There's no way he would have taken the job. And we would have had to buy the farm and pay all the cost to move. And his wife was very well employed and had a very serious career. We would have torn that family apart. And
Yeah,
that's when we started years and years ago, as we started this. That's what in our values culturally, which internally says family first, we went remote first and foremost to get the best people without messing up their families. We felt
yeah,
that
that's
was a
amazing.
major strength, um, and it's worked out well for us. Your second point, again, we're an example of. We have about a 40% lower cost for our uh, employee cost, our total personnel cost, than if we were to have hired only in the U.S. And
Yeah,
so that makes our revenue per employee ratio hugely higher and adds a lot more company value, which means it's easier to access capital. We don't have any, we're self funded, but it would be much easier to access capital or create any sort of corporate valuation model because of that. So
yeah,
the business side of it, I get totally. It's just always a challenge to think of what's that first move.
yeah. I, if I have to imagine a company that's not currently remote first and that just wants to start, so imagine a company that does have a few people in the same region or has a bunch of offices, but really want to explore this external
Uh-huh.
remote first space. I think I think the friction to start is actually a lot lower than what people imagine, right? So one, when you make that role available before you've even thought about how you're going to hire this person, the attraction is going to be gigantic. In I think it was 2022 Q4, we had posted a role at remote, right? And this role had somehow gone viral between LinkedIn, Instagram, and other socials. And we,
I'm just going to stop right there.
yeah, yeah,
Socials. How important are socials in the development of a remote first recruiting plan? Because I think that's probably pretty critical.
yeah, great question. I think if a company just believes they can just put a position on their careers page and hope for the best, I think nothing's going to happen. They are going to get 2% or less than what they even expect to get, right? And I think having a network, having a company LinkedIn profile, or people at the company that can advocate for the role, whether that is a talent acquisition or recruiter, right? Or whether that's one of the leadership team members that has a relatively large following or building a following, right? It's absolutely vital to get that out there on places like LinkedIn. We even advertise positions on places like Instagram, YouTube, wherever we have the opportunity. I think one of the tips that's actually served me very well is to create a Loom video or any video, any recording about the job. Get the hiring manager to create a recording about this job for 2 minutes about why anyone should be interested and post that with the job on social media, whether that is LinkedIn, Instagram, wherever your socials, X, wherever your socials live, right? The attraction is just going to be so much larger than just leaving it on some careers page and hope for the best.
Well,
And those tools are evolving, right? They're also changing at the moment. Yeah,
you're absolutely right. They're changing, they're accelerating in that
yeah,
change. And I think that I heard it said by another guest a while ago that the battle for talent is actually larger than the battle for market share. That
yeah,
talent is the war you have to focus on winning. If you win that war, then you'll automatically, or almost automatically, win the war for competition and market share. So
yeah,
I think a lot of companies aren't focused on that. It is we're talking about remote first, but underneath that, strategically for any company growing, it's talent first.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely. There are also amazing companies now that has created job boards, right? I wouldn't say in competition with LinkedIn, but that has a massive following where any remote job can be advertised freely on their job board, right? And that does amplify people from visiting that particular job board over and over again to find that key role and starting to know that brand as the company to go and find a remote job, right? And I think it's important if you're going to hire talent remotely that you start figuring out who those companies are, networking with them, building a relationship with them, so you can also access their funnel. They might have experts or talent that's been watching them that job board for years, right? And so that's also a critical way to go outside of the usual spaces and outside of maybe your comfort zone to go and find these folks.
Well, some data that we got from Randstad. You're familiar with what the I
Yeah,
guess Randstad's the largest recruiting company in the world. Um, is that when they run an ad for a position and include the words either remote or hybrid within the job description, they get about a 5-to-1 return. So if you have a funnel filter in your job thing, having 5 times as many potential candidates is going to probably yield better bottom end talent. Uh, uh,
absolutely.
there's a certain logic to that. But one of the questions that I hear, I don't know how you deal with this, is security. Okay, we just hired someone, and let's see, they're in wherever. I don't want to besmirch any particular country, but they're in something. We don't know them. We have no control over them, of their activities. How do we manage the security elements of our intellectual property, of
Yeah.
our potentially sensitive material, financial materials, the materials of our customers that's proprietary to our customer. How are those challenges met effectively with large remote only organizations?
Yeah, I think there's a huge component of doing the basics right. And so implementing background checks nowadays is not what it was in the past. We get results within hours, sometimes within minutes, right? And so it's not expensive and it's not friction heavy to simply run an identity background check just to confirm the person is who they say they are, right? And
That's the first
many,
step.
yeah, that's the first step, right?
Second step is management processes and procedures
Yeah,
that are,
yeah.
do they have to be more rigid in a remote only company in your view? Um, if so, in what way?
Yeah. In open source companies, and the ones I certainly worked for, I wouldn't necessarily say that they're more rigid. I think they're just really smart in terms of how they're operating and how they run their business. There's very simple apps. I'm trying to think of the name. I think it's called Kanji, right?
Yeah.
That it's an app that you install. It helps you with onboarding and offboarding. You can sync it to tools like Okta, which is a single sign-on platform.
Mhm.
I think Google has a single sign-on nowadays, which is
Sure.
awesome and epic, right? There's many others. So not selling these tools, but just focusing on like, do I need single sign-on to make sure I can easily manage access control and see what people do with that access? And two, do I need a tool like Kanji that should something go wrong, that I can instantly figure out where my red flags are? Many of these companies, of course, later on need things like SOC type 1 or SOC type 2, certifications. And then that audit process is going to help you uncover anything, but that's already too late. So I actually think start very simply with like, how are you onboarding people through systems and tools? What can you access in those systems and tools without the need to track all their work? Just figuring out what is going to highlight a red flag or something in production that's going wrong, or how are you protecting customer data, right?
Yeah.
Because privacy laws.
That's the
So
most
figuring,
thing. That's the
yeah,
you have a
yeah,
you can lose your own money, but
absolutely.
your moral obligation to protect your customers is hugely higher than to protect
Yeah,
yourself. Um,
yeah,
so I get
yeah,
you. You made a comment about efficiency in compensation. that sometimes the same position in three different countries has three different compensation structures. How do you calculate and balance that? Somebody in one country is doing exactly the same work as somebody in another country, maybe
Yeah.
even better work, um, and yet they're compensated half of what
Yeah.
goes on in the other country. So the difference between London, let's say, and the Philippines is
Yeah.
massive.
It is massive.
How do you have equity and compensation structures so that you um, literally aren't discriminating based on
Yeah.
location?
Yeah. So equal pay, right, is about two people having the same job in the same location. So to clarify for the audience, like if we're talking equal pay, it's about imagine you and I both live in Las Vegas. We both have the same job title. We should be paid equally, right?
Yeah,
And
agreed.
sometimes there's a pay range. And so as long as we're both within that range, it's equal and fair. But equitable pay works a little bit differently when you have all these different, locations, geographies, um, going as far as cities, right, within that. And my and your cost of living looks entirely different, right? But my and your taxes might look very different as well. My healthcare system might look entirely different between the UK and the Philippines, for example. That doesn't mean in the Philippines you have it easier. It doesn't necessarily mean you have all this access to things. It simply means it looks completely different. And, Frank, I've built many compensation structures in my career. And I've seen companies really do global pay very well, where they pay everyone equally, no matter where they are. If I had to start a company, I wouldn't start with that. I think it's a very expensive exercise. It's very hard to keep it going when maybe times get harder financially or you're not profitable yet, etc. Right? So if I had to think about the basics, how can I start a company and be equitable and fair, but scrappy in the beginning to make sure I can build on it later, and simple enough to change, right? I would start thinking about, where am I benchmarking my pay structures? Am I benchmarking it maybe in a location like Boston or Atlanta? That's what many companies, global remote companies, does. And that would be my 100% benchmark, right? And then I would figure out, what is the minimum I want to pay people, right? Is there a minimum? Compliantly, there is. In companies like Germany, they have many minimum pay. In many other countries in the world, they have minimum pay.
Exactly.
In developing countries, it's extremely low. So I would never recommend that. I would stay away from minimum pay in a country like Philippines or South Africa. I think that's very hard to live on, just, to create awareness. But if I think about minimum pay and I start thinking about, I want to be competitive. I don't want to overpay anyone, but I want to be competitive. Something Doist does really well is our minimum pay is 75% of that 100% benchmark. So if we're benchmarking against Boston, we pay a minimum of 75% of that anywhere in the world. And then in between that, we obviously have mapped locations and geolocations to that benchmark.
Mhm.
And that also means a place like New York might be at 110% of that benchmark. And San Francisco might be, or Las Vegas might be at 115% of that benchmark. But then,
That's all California taxes, so it
yeah,
doesn't.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. So I think, and look, you also have countries like Switzerland and Japan where you've got to pay above the 100% benchmark because their cost of living and their pay ranges are simply a ton higher. They live in an environment that's a lot more expensive than what my location is. So I really like the simplicity of that. It's very scalable. It's still very competitive to pay people in this way. But it's also easy to manage for a very small finance or people team, right? Depending on what you have, or HR team, depending on what you have. Some people just have an ops person, right? Some people just have a people person or a finance person. So I feel like the simpler you can start, the easier it is to scale. Um,
One of the things that I see as a challenge that we've had as a challenge, honestly, is currencies. We might start at an equivalent, as you say, of 75% of a base uh, geography.
yeah,
Okay, we'll use Atlanta, and we figure all that out. We say, yeah, that is an equal or better lifestyle in another location.
Yeah.
But do you pay them in dollars or do you pay them in local currency? And when local currency valuations change against the dollar, if you're earning dollars in your company, as an example,
Yeah.
um, um, your compensation structures are continuously changing as a result of exchange rates.
Yeah.
Uh, we see that all the time. We used to pay everybody in dollars. Okay, and then we had problems with local taxes for employment taxes and things in various other countries, and so we had to stop doing that. Now we pay in the
Yeah.
local currency, and we see every month exchange rates up and down, up and down, up and down, moving all over the place. So we have much more of a variable cost, and it's not always favorable. It's not always unfavorable, but it you say, well, it'll work out, but sometimes it takes 2 or 3 years to work out, to level out. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, you're right that it does start with how you've employed people, right? So whether you've hired them as contractors or employees via a vendor, like an employer of record, right?
Yeah,
Like Remote, Oyster, those kind of companies. So one, it starts with that. Did you hire them as a contractor or are they an employee of your company? If they're an employee, they have to get paid in local currency. You've got to give them that option. But some countries, you can have multiple currencies. Like Europe is a very good example where you can get paid in US dollars or Euro or euros. And I think what no one knows is the behind the scenes work of compensation isn't simple always. And annually, what Doist does and what I've done in my past career as well is we have a rolling average running in the background that we constantly check between US dollar, euro, and other currencies. Usually, you will have a limit of how many currencies you work in, right? And you will have your main currency, which is very often USD. And then, based on that rolling averages, you give all your employees once a year an opportunity to change currencies. We've just gone through that now in November, depending on the location that they're in, right? So if they're already an employee and they paid in their local currency, they can't change back to US dollars. They're an employee, they've got an employment contract, they've got to get paid in a specific currency in their country. But if they're not, they can change the currency once a year. And
okay.
that sometimes that benefits folks, sometimes it doesn't. And that's why I'm saying you've nearly got to roll that back end, have a rolling average running in the back end to check how it's fluctuating. In developing countries, people do huge comparisons. They're like, oh my goodness, 6 months ago I was paid this, now I'm paid this. But if I'm an employee, I would be less focused on that and start looking at in my local currency, how has things changed? Is it changing significantly? And would it be better to have a non-fluctuating salary and just get paid in my local pay? Countries like Argentina,
Yeah,
Nigeria,
Tina,
yeah, they've had a very, very rough time.
bringing the
Yeah,
wheelbarrow full of money.
yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. And they, I've seen countries do companies do very courageous things where they actually help um, help change that with USD or something else, right? But their local laws also come into play, their local taxes come into play, and that we can't all control, which is
yeah,
yeah,
when we look at local laws and your comment around remote.com or third party employment groups or independent contractor structures, those all work up to a certain scale.
yeah,
3 people here, 2 people there, but you put 20 or 30 people in a remote facility, and all of a
yeah,
sudden the law says, "These aren't contractors anymore."
yeah,
So you actually have to, establish a local company in that country and do all your compensation under the rules of that country, overall. So much of what you're saying, I think, really applies well to larger organizations, but to a startup like you and I are going to do, we're going to do a startup tomorrow and sell things that
yeah,
maybe is going to have 10 people scattered around. You really have to have your contractor or your third party model worked out and have people willing, because with contractors, they don't always have the same benefit structures,
yeah,
willing to work in that, which again narrows your selection of individuals um, uh,
Yeah.
overall in that battle for talent. So you have to be
Yeah.
very careful looking at this stuff to not you, but we all, to not
Yeah.
overly generalize and to strategically set up that plan that
Yeah.
says, here's how we're going to do it. And it has to be established a year well in advance. Um, it is a strategic plan, not a tactical move.
No.
Um,
I will say GitLab went public, and this is public knowledge, so I'm not sharing something I shouldn't. But GitLab went public with various employment structures and based on the country, right, in place. And in some of those locations,
you have to be a big company in
yeah,
order to do it. You have to have a
yeah,
large HR department, and your finance department has to be sophisticated enough, and your own
absolutely.
capital structure has to be sophisticated enough to manage those things. And
Yeah,
then, I mean, every major international company deals with this. In fact, in
yeah,
the flexible workspace, this is a good illustration. In the flexible workspace industry, one of the largest contingents of customers are large corporates that need to move into a particular locale. So we had one a little while ago that needed to move into Accra in Nigeria, and they thought, well, we don't want to hire secretarial, clerical, and administrative staff. We're just going to hire a sales rep. So they didn't have to deal with all the support structure because they were using a flexible workspace.
yeah.
Um, that supplied all of that as part of its services. So that's another model, the virtual office model, the remote work model that large companies, gosh, every global Fortune 1000 company uses that model
This
in some
is,
way or another.
yeah. On a small scale, so if you and I did only have 10 contractors globally, I do really like what companies like Wave Money is doing in developing African locations and even Asia
Mhm.
Pacific and other developing countries, where Wave Money provides access to people to gain money in their location without getting trapped into some sort of political situation, right? Where
Mhm.
they can't access any money. So if you can imagine some of the major issues we've seen all over Africa, etc., Wave Money has made it possible for people to still access money if they're working for an international company legitly, right? And had to set up the banking infrastructure for people to do so legitly, but avoiding the I can't access my bank account because everything's been frozen. It's offline, right? And so I think those type of even Wise Money makes it way easier to access money. Companies like Remote and other smaller EORs are even creating opportunities to pay in things like cryptocurrencies, right? For those that genuinely want to be paid in that. So a certain portion of their salary can even go to that. So I think at small scale, there's so many opportunities now. I feel like I would love to start a company and just hire 10 people globally because I think the opportunities are so different from what it was.
I agree. There's
Yeah.
another company, its name's eluding me right now, that is um, third party company like Upwork, Fiverr, etc. And they actually have a compensation structure that prepays the contractors in advance of their receipt of payment by the employer, if you will,
Amazing.
so that the employees don't have to suffer with that collection process overall. That's made them very, very popular with the higher end contractors who can stabilize.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a creative process that they were looking at solving a problem of the employee, not just managing their business well. And that stability, I think, it gives them an advantage. Gosh,
Amazing.
well, let's do this. Let's start a company.
Great.
You know, you can run it. I'll work for you. That's easy. And let's turn all this on its ear and start a huge employment agency that only does this one thing, that only does remote. And I know they're out there, but ours would be better, of course.
Yeah.
And really try to lead the future of work by distributed work overall.
Yeah.
You know,
I think between your experience and mine, we will get so much people out of unemployment really quickly, which is one of the things
we're
I'd
going
love
to
to
change the
solve.
world. We are going to change the world. No, I really remote first. It's always made sense. I mean,
Yeah.
where are you working right now? Are you at your office or your residence?
Yeah, I'm at home. I have a beautiful home office with all my kids' art here on my wall, and I'm sitting just outside a pool here in Johannesburg because the sun is always
I'm at
shining.
home too, and the pool is to the left. And I've worked remotely and from my residence for at least 30 years. Um, uh, Always believing I had more efficient use of my time. And we've always used technology for communications like we're doing now. And one of the things I've found, and this has to do with remote teams and overall, is that if you're really comfortable with yourself, you can establish a very strong remote relationship, sometimes even better than if you're in the office every day with
Yeah,
people when they're working at distance. And I'll say you and I as an example. I'm much more likely to be true and vulnerable to you remotely and 100% candid and honest and that sort of thing because you're at a distance than I am if I see you every day in the office. And this is something I don't think a lot of people relate to and has a lot to do with the culture of remote companies can actually be stronger than the culture of companies where everybody comes into the office every day.
yeah,
Uh, and that's something, I think that's a topic for another day because we're kind of running out of time.
yeah,
But let's regather up or maybe do a follow-up article on how to manage cultures and inside of remote first companies by comparison to, we all take an hour commute on the train to get into the same office every day.
yeah. I'd love that. I'd love that, Frank. I think the other thing it does is the emotional maturity it sometimes builds to give you time to process information after a call. In
Agreed.
an office, the emotions can be very high. You can you can visibly see it, and that can often burn a relationship, right? But if someone has a chance to step away from their desk for a moment, take a step outside, have a cup of coffee, take a breather, I think it helps them process information and news or feedback a lot better than when it's face to face in an office where it can get really awkward really quickly, right? Where you're not quite ready to just react. So I think there's major benefits in terms of being that vulnerable, right? And then having the space to have a great life outside of work and process information. Yeah.
I agree completely. Well, thank you, Nadia, so much. I really appreciate it. I know Doist is an absolute pioneer and a huge success story in remote first, thousands of employees worldwide, and you've done the same in other companies. So not only is Doist a pioneer, but you personally are a pioneer, and I thank you for your time today.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Frank. So great to catch up with you today.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
If it's impacting the future of work, it's in the Future of Work podcast by allwork.space.